The Transmogrification of Wamba's Revenge by H.L. Gold. In the previous episode, we discovered the nature of Wamba's revenge as she revealed it to Professor Todd. Using one of her tribe's most secret and taboo substances, she has shrunk Lundeen and Mrs. Todd to 1/10 normal size. To Wamba's chagrin, Professor Todd, despite his upset, is now intrigued, and as Wamba has admitted that she is not supposed to know about the secret moss, he blackmails her into helping him grow more of it for his experiments. Meanwhile, for their testimony regarding Lundeen and his wife's apparent death, Professor Todd promises to donate part of his inheritance to developing and enlarging the pygmy compound to accommodate a gathering of all the tribes, plus 100 or more guests, and even an airfield, all to be done within a month. He also takes a number of blood samples from tribe members. Neither Wamba, her husband, the head witch doctor, nor her father, the super chief, can figure out what Todd is up to. What mysterious plans does Professor Todd have, and what will become of Wamba's secret? Find out in Episode 3 of H.L. Gold's The Transmogrification of Wamba's Revenge.
Chapter 4. With March 22nd came bush planes to the landing field that had been completed only the night before. They discharged their passengers and took off to make room for more incoming bush planes. Professor Todd shook hands with each passenger. They waved hello to each other and then were taken, along with their luggage, to the guest huts. Every hut had a sign listing the nationality of its occupants, or, for the large ones, its function. Oh, I forgot to mention that Todd had had a generator truck come in and string electrical cables to all the huts and to light the streets. The guests accepted it as normal, but our tribes were amazed and delighted.
I say, Princess,
said Lundeen in one of his rare polite moments.
The joint seems to be jumping. Is it because of us?
Not at all, I gloated. The professor gave me his word that he wouldn't betray my awful revenge.
Awful is the word. How could you do such a thing?
I didn't know, I said guiltily. I knew it would shrink you somewhat, but I never suspected.
Never mind what you never suspected,
said Lundeen, rattling the door of their cage.
Get us out of here. It's not decent to lock up two human beings like a couple of canaries.
It's better than you deserve, I snapped back, pulling the cover down over the cage to shut out their accusing voices. Professor Todd unlocked the door and came into the lab, locking the door again before sitting on a stool in the flow of the air conditioner.
This is the only tolerable place in the compound. Wish I'd had time to air condition the huts.
Please, Professor, take the cover off. We'll behave.
Todd ignored him, saying,
Every last person I sent a cablegram to is here. Not a single absentee.
That's wonderful, I said. And you all seem to know one another. He gave me a wicked grin.
You'd love to know what's going on, wouldn't you? But you can't ask because that would be rude, right?
I admitted it.
Well, you and the others of your tribes are invited to the meeting hut tonight. And you'll learn about what you and I have been doing for the past few weeks.
But what about us?
Shrilled Mrs. Todd under the cover.
What about you? Seems to me that your bodies just about fit your souls.
However, it was an indication of his own great soul that he uncovered their cage and left the light on before locking the laboratory. Can you imagine what those two would have done if the situation were reversed? So could I. I said so.
Princess, if a person, a family, a tribe, or a nation imitates an enemy's cruelty or oppression, there would be nothing to distinguish one from the other. The more morality you give up, the more animal you become. The less you deserve to win an argument or a war.
Even temporarily? Just long enough to win?
No. Before, during, and after the duration, however long it takes, however necessary it seems.
He unclenched his fist and smiled crookedly.
Sorry. It's the one subject I get violent on. See you in the meeting hut.
Shaken by his vehemence, I watched him stride off to his own hut, a young man aged before his time by clinging to ideals all but gone in a world heading for a final smash-up. I found my husband and the super chief in our hut, listening to the news on my portable radio while waiting supper for me. I sat down and the number 2 and number 3 wives served us a really good warthog stew. I complimented them and they giggled a thank you. To me then it was just an average cozy family scene with no hint of the incredible turmoil so short a time away. I hope they all know how much I miss them wherever they are. Depressed as we always were by the world's headlong rush towards destruction, the head witch doctor turned off the radio and asked whether I knew anything more than I had the day before. Afraid not, I said, but the professor assured me we would learn all about it tonight.
Just more blood samples?
He said. I nodded. I asked the chest and belly witch doctors what it could mean. They told me they didn't know, but judging from the attendance here with scientists from everywhere on Earth, it must be as important a discovery as antibiotics.
I hope you can translate it into pygmy that I can understand,
said Super Chief. I'll do my best, I promise, but science was never my best subject.
I just hope I can stay awake. I've got a 6-month backlog of mental cases since the other tribes came.
If I can help with the laying on of hands, call on me.
Thanks. I'll keep that in mind. Wait, there's a young girl who...
I left them talking shop and wandered around the compound just as the lights came on. Huge as it was, it seemed more crowded even than New York or Boston. Each hut spilling adults and children of all ages into the street, and everywhere underfoot ran the multitudes of dogs that had come along as part of each family. Naturally, I had to say hello every step of the way, so I was glad to join the crowd entering the meeting hut. By pygmy standards, the hut was as enormous as Yankee Stadium. There were wooden benches that the professor had ordered built, spaced evenly from the entrance to the movie screen at the extreme end, leaving only enough room for the aisles, which right now were jammed with men and women from all over, clustered in loud, gesticulating groups. They mostly spoke English, though. I did hear some French and Russian.
Order. Please, order,
said the voice of Professor Todd over the loudspeakers mounted on the poles holding up the roof.
Everyone, please be seated.
The hubbub died as the people took their seats, including us pygmies, and I saw Todd in the center aisle with the movie projector.
This had better be good,
Someone said very loudly.
That is for posterity to judge. But I think my using the secret assembly call will be justified.
He dimmed the house lights and turned on the projector. The screen lit up with vividly colored swimming shapes that I recognized as bacteria and blood cells. This, of course, was what the professor and I had been filming with microscope and movie camera. Into this swarming colony came a giant, blunt object, a pipette, and suddenly the bacteria began shrinking. The crowd murmured excitedly.
That's our secret ingredient. How did he get hold of it?
The work parties, I suggested innocently. He nodded and subsided as the professor explained that the substance, unknown anywhere else in the world, was shrinking one deadly bacillus after another right before their eyes.
Why doesn't it shrink the blood cells?
Someone called out.
That needs more study. After all, I have been here only a few weeks.
What about viruses?
Somebody else inquired. He was intimating that they too were undoubtedly shrunken, but that his equipment had necessarily been limited in portability, while I, translating all this to the super chief with one part of my mind, was using the other part to figure out another question. Why hadn't the blood cells also contracted? The answer came to me so suddenly that I almost jumped up and blurted it out. The blood was from us pygmies and Lundeen and Mrs. Todd only, which led to still another question. How would he keep the audience from testing it on their own blood? I didn't know, but my respect for him had grown even greater. I was sure he had it all worked out in his mind. When the film ended, the scientists sat stunned. One man finally stood up and said,
If I have seen a discovery worthy of the Nobel Prize, this is it.
Everybody applauded. Professor Todd looked as if he wished he had a pebble to kick so he could say, "Aw, shucks, fellas." They crowded around him, noisier than before the show, while my people left the meeting hut in cold silence. I pretended to have some reason for going to the laboratory, but my husband took my wrist in his hand and led me politely but firmly to our hut.
We have some matters that need to be taken care of,
he said, and the chiefs and witch doctors of the tribes nodded grimly. He pulled the old trunk from beneath his bunk and opened it. The 5 rocks looked exactly as they always had, and why not? I had exposed the moss to light until the little scratches I had made grew back again. But I needn't have bothered, I discovered, for he dragged it into the street, filled it with firewood, and threw a blazing torch into it.
There. Wherever the professor got his sample no longer matters. It is a sheer miracle that it hadn't been discovered long ago.
He turned
Princess,
toward me.
You must find and destroy his specimen.
Right. If it is used by everyone, being a pygmy won't be the great honor it is today.
Maybe they won't want the honor, I said diplomatically.
Not want it? Have you ever heard such nonsense?
Never,
said the head witch doctor, and even I had to join the nodding. I hadn't believed my suggestion for an instant. He pointed in the general direction of the lab and said, Go.
Do your duty.
I left quickly, and as a good little pygmy wife should, and a few minutes later was at the lab, ringing the doorbell. The professor peeked at me through the peephole and let me in, pointing to the other stool. I climbed up it as he raised the volume of his radio-looking thing, which he had been listening to.
This will give you a kick, Princess. Recognize anybody's voice?
I had been looking intently at the enameled tray as he had dumped the test tube into it and put up near the nightlight, and wondering how I could get up there without his noticing. It was impossible with him present. I would have to find an excuse for staying after he left and hope he would believe it. I unfrowned and cocked my head toward the radio, pretending to listen, and almost fell off the stool, for, hearing the squeaky little voices of Lundeen and Mrs. Todd, I glanced up and saw their cage with the door open and them gone. How? How? I stammered.
By tying tag strings together and getting through the air conditioning duct,
he said happily. You don't look as if you cared, I said.
Oh, but I do. Listen, they're at the English hut.
Naturally, I said. Where else would that silly Anglophile go? A genuine British voice could now be heard saying,
Isn't it as if we doubted your word, old boy? But how do you know you weren't always this size, and that this perfectly ordinary-looking moth you brought us isn't perfectly ordinary?
Lundeen's very high, very excited, and very fake British voice said,
Dash it all! Try it on yourselves!
On ourselves?
Echoed
What
another speaker.
What if it's poisonous or something?
Absolutely.
The first man agreed. There was silence broken by the barking of the ubiquitous dogs outside.
I have got it. Why not try it on one of those cursed mongrels?
Capital idea. Excellent suggestion.
And other compliments led to someone going out into the street and returning shortly with a yapping mutt.
How do we feed it to him? In Scotch, like you?
I don't think dogs drink scotch. Why not water?
Why not, indeed?
Said the first man. There was a splashing sound, followed by a mixing sound, and he said,
Here you are, Bowser. Drink it down like a good fellow.
which was succeeded by a lapping sound, then silence.
Great Scott!
One of the men cried in horror, and the rest made a sort of suppressed retching sound.
You see? You see?
Lundeen and Mrs. Todd kept shrilling. When it was all over, the first man asked,
Did anyone think of measuring the poor beast before and after?
No, but I'd say he's no more than 1/10 his original size.
a man answered. The others agreed.
Well, let's get down to cold facts, shall we? The stuff works. I think we're all convinced of that. That being so, the next question is, have you brought us enough to serve as a starter set?
Plenty! I've dumped the same amount into a tray and kept it under a light, and now its tray is almost overflowing.
I looked up at the tray and down at Professor Todd, who was listening with a great beatific smile on his face. So that was why he had emptied the test tube with such seeming indifference. With equal seeming indifference, I moved my stool under the light. He didn't notice. I took a beaker of some acid and warily stood on the stool. His back was to me when I poured the acid into the tray. I climbed down and put the beaker back just as he turned off the radio and swung round to face me.
Let's get out of here, Princess. Those two have to get back in again without suspecting we know what they've done.
Of course, I assented readily. Half of my job was done. The only problem remaining was, how could I get rid of the last of the moss in the British guest hut? Todd and I said goodnight, and he made for his hut while I went toward the British one. Crouching in its shadow, I waited until the light was doused. When I was sure they were all asleep, I began edging to the door. I heard a faint noise and stopped dead. A man in his pajamas came stealing out. He darted from hut to hut, pausing at each one to look about before going on to the next. He slipped into the 7th hut, and in a moment the light went on. I sneaked up to the hut and listened, in its shadow naturally.
Mean by waking us up?
A heavy Slavic voice was demanding.
I had to. It's of the utmost importance. Now please listen attentively. I may not have time to repeat.
And he told them all about Lundeen, Mrs. Todd, and the moss and the dog. When he finished, someone laughed. As if at a signal, the others began laughing too.
Please, please, if you don't believe me, try it on a dog, but do it quickly before I'm missed.
It is your story. You get the dog.
I retreated behind the hut as the man in pajamas came out and looked up and down the street.
Just my luck. They're all asleep. Here, Spot. Here, Prince. Fido. Rags.
And he snapped his fingers until a dog a few huts away came ambling up with its tail wagging drowsily. He took it inside. For the next space of time, I was glad again that I only had to hear the process instead of seeing it.
So, it is like you say. The dog is maybe a tenth of its former size. So?
What good is that? Who would want such a little dog?
For this, you expect to get paid?
Damn, and double damn. Do you think I'm a traitor? I brought you some of this stuff because it might have military importance. Don't ask me how. I'm only a scientist. But if it does, I don't want one half of the world using it on the other half. And that means your half as well as mine.
Duh. We have such soft-headed people among us, too. But it could be. It could be.
Well, you work it out yourselves. I must get back now.
Wait. What should we do with the little dog?
That's your problem,
said the Englishman, sprinting out the door. So I set the hut afire, then went down to the British hut and did the same there. There were lovely fires. I stood admiring them while the men of both huts came rushing out.
Did you save anything?
Just the moss and my tennis racket.
My heart fell, but it lifted as I followed the Englishman with the peculiar morality to the Russian hut.
Did you save the moss?
Just that, and my balalaika,
the leader said. I trudged wordly home to bed. My husband, the head witch doctor, opened his eyes and asked,
Have you destroyed the moss?
Half of it, I said with elliptical truth. I didn't dare tell him. Now I had 2 more halves to destroy.
Thank you. This completes episode 3 of the Transmogrification of Wamba's Revenge by H.L. Gold.